This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. And what I'm looking at today is 2021's Urban Horror Series, which is already confusing because this is not a television series. It's an anthology movie. And it makes me think that the producers were somewhat copying American Horror Story in terms of the feel. And even the poster is reminiscent of that property. So that was a little bit irritating, truth be told. Though I gave it a watch. And on the strength of the first episode, I was expecting a lot from this. And the story itself is not much to write home about, truth be told. These two people are in a house. You don't know why they're there necessarily, though you do know that there's something really sinister going on in said house. Urban Horror Series is an anthology. So you have 5, actually 6, so technically it's 5, different stories written and directed by different individuals. There should be, at the very least, a thematic element running through each episode of the anthology. It could be anything that all the episodes hold in common, a common link, if you will. And Urban Horror Series doesn't have that. All the episodes are loosely related. Some are quite supernatural in nature, others aren't at all. So that's a pity. I would have preferred that every episode at least had a thematic link in common. They really don't. And it's worth mentioning that the title, Urban Horror Series, besides the aforementioned similarity to American Horror Story, bugs me because typically when you put urban in front of anything, you're talking black, as in black people. And there are some in this movie. So I just wish they would just stop using that term in that way. Originally it referred to cities, though our politicians, unfortunately, very much corrupted the term. And it's borderline offensive when it's used, typically, so I don't like that. Though, as I was saying, I was particularly impressed by a haunting in POTTERSFIELD. You have to keep in mind, each episode only lasts somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 11 minutes. There's not a lot of time to establish story, not really. So, considering that, they do pretty good with what they have. Though what impressed me most about The Haunting of POTTERSFIELD is that the story is very well shot. There's a way the director uses focal length to determine what you should be focused on that I really like. And it's something I don't see a lot in feature films, and I wish it were there more. For instance, if you see the episode, if the director wants you to look at the camera, for instance, which happens, the camera is sharp. The camera is very clearly defined in the frame, but nothing else is. So, which is to say, everything around the camera is blurry. So your eye naturally goes to the camera. And this is a technique I've seen in other movies, but as I said, you don't see it often enough, and I really enjoyed seeing it here. It struck me as very cinematic, and something that I found interesting, because as I said, the story is certainly not going to hold me. Though, for the cinematic looks alone, this struck me as a particularly good first episode. The second episode of Urban Horror Series, God, I hate that title, is called Last Wish, directed by FELICIA HOWELL. And it's not a bad story by any stretch. It revolves around this man whose sister recently died, and he was given her home in her will. And the only condition was that he has to dispose of her ashes, she was cremated, at a waterfall. it's not terribly supernatural, really. And this is what I was saying about thematics and why they're so important. It would have, if the story were of a more supernatural bent, it would have better linked it to the first story. And it would have been, I think, made the viewing experience more fulfilling. As it stands, Last Wish is fine. But it's a little weaker than The Haunting of Pottersfield, to be sure. The third episode of urban horror series is called Lover's Discretion, directed by Campbell, who also produced. It is fine. The acting is probably some of the most dramatic of any of the episodes, and is fine. It revolves around a woman who believes her husband is cheating on her, and the lengths she'll go through to see that that does not happen again. Decent story, but as I said, the thematic unevenness shows itself once again, because Lover's Discretion is not particularly supernatural at all. It's essentially just a murder story. Now, in and of itself, it's fine if this is revolving around a murder, but the opening story was supernatural. The second story was not. The third story was not. This is what I mean when I say it lacks thematic consistency. If it's going to be supernatural type things, make it supernatural type things. Every episode has to touch on that, at the very least. If not, don't. Which would be a pity, because The Haunting in Pottersfield, as I said, is the strongest episode of this series. The fourth episode is called Sangre de Vida, directed and produced by Jordan Gavreau, I believe it's pronounced. And this is kind of a twist on the vampire story. Interesting. But, as I said, not enough time to really explore what's going on. That being the case, I wish that the director had taken a similar route to the first story, which is to say, get to the point. Make it happen as quick as you possibly can, because you don't have time. As it stands, it could be supernatural in nature, though it's kind of hard to tell, because you're not really given enough information about it. It's not bad. None of the stories are bad. It's just lacking in time to develop it, which is why the director should have went bolder. The fifth story is called Trangress, directed by Angela White, and it's not bad. It's somewhat overdone, though, unfortunately. It revolves around, I want to say, a crime scene investigator, someone who works for the police. You don't get a lot of information. And she comes upon this apple, and then things get weird. This is very much supernatural based, but it revolves around snakes, by the way. And I should mention some very good CGI snakes in this episode. Some of the best I've ever seen. Really good CGI snakes. Though, the problem is that the narrative tends to spend time in places where it doesn't need to do it. Or at the very least, it can be done more effectively. Not a bad episode, not necessarily its strongest either. It's quite well acted, but still, it's the writing that hurts it. And I have to emphasize, these episodes are so short. There is no time, really, to flesh out a story, which is why, particularly in the case of Transgress, it feels very jumpy in terms of the narrative. In fact, one scene moves into another scene, and I literally thought it was another episode entirely. It's just a quantum change from what came before. that's to be expected on some level, but it also could have been avoided. The 6th episode of Urban Horror series is called Runnin', no G. And this is interesting. It's essentially a music video revolving around a mass killer, which is an interesting idea and a novel interpretation of telling a story, because it does tell a story. Just, it's a music video essentially, which is interesting, but I would have liked it to be more traditional, as in take away the music and just have the people doing whatever. So that being said, Urban Horror series is not bad. It's certainly not great. It's a bit uneven as well, though with 6 stories, each lasting no more than 11 minutes, it's worth looking at just the same. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. If you agree, disagree, let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.